Hello and welcome to Seance, our Deathtrap tomb design stream here on the Adventure Archive. This will be our last episode, our wrap up. My name is Ryan, and with me is the master of the Deathtrap dungeon himself, Sersa Victory. How are you doing tonight?
I am surviving. It's kind of wild to think that it's already the end of the series. I feel like when we started this, uh, 11, 12 episodes seemed like forever away, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I feel. I feel like we were like, man, that's 12 episodes is going to be crazy. And then suddenly it's literally done and it feels like we just started. So
Yeah, I feel like we've really kind of only scratched the surface on a lot of the topics that we've discussed in the series. And that's kind of what tonight's episode is going to be about, is a little bit of a wrap up, an opportunity for you to ask questions, for the audience to ask questions about any of the topics that we covered, or really just kind of general questions related to adventure design. And my hope is that on the back of this, people feel like they've got a process that they can start to follow that will help them create engaging, memorable, challenging dungeon adventures. And that's where I wanted to start tonight. Thankfully, there's no lecture tonight. We're just kind of, you and I are going to converse, freestyle it a little bit. But the first thing that I wanted to ask you was, how are you feeling on the back of this series? I know we mentioned at the very beginning that, I didn't show you any of the exercises beforehand. Like, you knew what the theme of each episode was going to be, but really, we didn't do a whole lot of pre-stream prep work, right? I kind of threw you in the deep end here. So I'm really curious if there was, what your impressions were on the back of this process. If you felt like there was anything that was sort of different than what you were anticipating, or things that surprised you about the process. I'm just kind of curious, sort of what your broad feelings are about what we just went through.
Not, I mean, if I'm surprised by anything, it's just kind of how easy the process was all the way through. Like, I think pretty much every episode, I talked about how each individual exercise is pretty, like, relatively easy and straightforward, but builds on, it is that way because it builds on what we already did. So, like, the first episode was pretty easy, come up with some verbs, come up with, themes, different stuff like that. And then I felt like every episode was just building on what you already did all the way through. So maybe some of the later episodes might have been, or like the later exercises might have been on their own, a little bit more difficult, but because of the way the process went, it was so easy. Sometimes we even got to a point where it's just like, well, we don't even need to do this one because we've already written all these ideas for, this other one, so we can pretty much just grab one and tweak it, or it fits right in, or it'd be really easy to make another one. So yeah, I think what American said in chat is it was very digestible, and yeah, I would say not really surprised by any part of it, just more surprised by just how easy the process was and how, I don't know, fun the process was compared to just trying to sit down and pull stuff out of your ass. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that you and folks in chat found the process relatively easy to understand and digestible, because one of the things that's kept me from really putting a lot of the stuff out there is because I feel like it's a lot more theoretically dense than what you might find. Like, for example, I was recently reading one of these other like guides to making a dungeon, like little quick guide, and I looked through it and it was legit just a few pages of like, roll on a table, and what is it, a castle, is it a tomb, who lives there, roll on this table, is it goblins or undead. And I was talking to somebody last week. I was traveling for work and got to run some in-person Shadow Dark for the first time. And the way that we were describing this thing that I was just telling you about is that it's like if you picked up a book on architecture and then everything was about like what color to paint the exterior, right? And that's not an unimportant or what kind of like Hobby Lobby art to put up in the in the conference rooms. Like, there's those things aren't unimportant, but they're not really, in my opinion, like substantive, uh, guidance on actually creating gameplay, right?
Right.
And
yeah, I think I know which one you're talking about too. So
yeah, so I feel like, I said I worried because this stuff can be a lot more theoretically dense. It's a lot to take in, and I think if you're just starting out, it can be kind of a more onerous process. I can imagine somebody looking through these episodes and being like, man, is the juice really worth the squeeze? Because this is like 16, 17 hours of process and keeping things like moments and choices and these sorts of things in your head when most people just want to sit down and roll on a table. And that's fine. But I am glad to hear that.
I'm gonna disagree. I'm gonna disagree with you on that. I feel like through a bunch of the episodes, you're like apologizing that it's so like dense, but that was like some of the most enjoyable parts. Was, you like distilling all of this clear knowledge you have and all these books you've read about it and stuff like that, and distilling it into at most maybe like a 10-minute lecture, you know what I mean? And then having this process to use that. I felt like that was super approachable, super digestible, and I think that would be great for people that haven't done a lot of this before, because I felt like, I've run games for a long time. I've read a lot of games. We have a whole podcast dedicated to reviewing games and stuff. But there were still parts of it where I was just like, oh, like that makes total sense. And I feel like there is this hesitation slash I don't even know what the word to use, dickishness in the scene about using things that aren't TTRPG related. Like, I'm not going to look at video games or board games for my TTRPG, and it's like, the D&D was just a war game with some RP thrown on it. It is a fucking game. Like, and it still is. So being able to use things from like, why are there manuals and experts and like all of these things? Like, you can go find a game design manual for video games and it's like $70-$80 and people will snatch it up like crazy because it's super well done and these people are experts in that field. But you're not really going to find that in tabletop role-playing games. And I don't know why there's this acceptance of like an academic approach in level design for video games, but people don't feel, not only do they not feel the need to have it in tabletop games, actually like rebel against the concept. Like, how could we learn anything from a video game? And it's just like, it's something that doesn't make sense to me. And as we went through this process and I've got some of the books that you've recommended and read through it, like, it's so not only easily adaptable to tabletop role-playing games, but just nice to be able to sit down and read more theory, because a lot of what you find is, like you just said, it's surface level BS. It's like, here's a table, here's how to use simulationist stuff, this is why the goblins are sad, like, and not about like you're talking about with moments or with why am I blanking on the name of the video game that the level design stuff is based on?
The cyclic dungeon stuff.
Dungeon design, like, that's so smart for tabletop role playing game design, and it really comes, it's based on theories from video game level design, and it's so good and it's so clever, and it makes it so much easier and more interesting to make dungeons. And people would rather roll on a table and build a room a day and like, do all this other crap. And it's just, I don't know. I felt that the lecture part and the theory part is not only digestible and approachable the way that you put it out there, but would be great for newer people to listen to, especially those that are like seeking information from somewhere, because this information isn't really anywhere that I can find, for tabletop games.
Yeah. I appreciate that you called out the sort of the academic DNA that's in what we're doing. In a previous career, I was an academic writer, and one of the things that you really had to do anytime you wrote like a book chapter or a journal article or even a conference presentation was you had to kind of give a review of the work that came before you, right? And go, okay, this is what I'm presenting today, this is what I'm writing about, and here are the writers, the theorists that came before me, kind of here's what their work talked about, and then here is how I'm going to build on that work. Because the idea being, like with any sort of, scientific or academic discipline, there's this idea of progress. Like you want to build on the work that people did before you to sort of move the field forward rather than just kind of stagnating and making the same points over and over again. And that's something that I see a lot in more like commercial game design type stuff. Like I recently just got a ton of newer game design books, and a lot of them, I think even maybe all of them, I haven't looked at them all yet, but usually spend the first part of the book saying kind of this is the work that's come before in the game design space. They'll cite a lot of the books, many of which we've talked about on this stream. And then, here's what this book is going to add on to that body of work. It's going to be in a conversation. And that's something, maybe I'm just being like a snob, which is a legitimate way to feel about it. But for me, whenever I'm looking at resources for advice on how to create adventures or really anything involving tabletop RPGs, for me, what determines whether or not I'm really going to get into it is if the writers are sort of doing that kind of acknowledgement of, okay, I'm not just reheating the same sort of surface level advice that people have been getting like in Dragon magazine since the 70s, but rather I've sort of looked at the research, looked at the literature, looked at what other people are doing, and then I'm building on top of that. I'm bringing something new to the table or trying to bring a fresh insight to a process. And I feel like that's something that, you're right, I don't really see a whole lot of in tabletop RPG books. It really does feel like people are in their own little worlds and not really engaging with the broader sort of discipline of game design. I mean, in my regular day job, I work in a design discipline, not game design, but a different kind. And I mean, that's something we do every single day is we look at the research, the writing, what other people are doing, and we try to integrate that into the work that we're doing. And when we're sitting down to create, digital interfaces or things like that, we don't just go, okay, let's just roll on a table to determine what font we're going to use. Or, we don't sit and really discuss things like, colors and those sorts of things. Not that those aren't important, but we've kind of solved those problems in my particular domain. And now it's like, what we need to do is actually design these interactions. What are people trying to accomplish with our digital interfaces? Things like sites, apps, phone apps, digital signs, those sorts of things. And then we look to the research and we look to people's experience in the field to guide what we do, right? Everything is about designing the experience. And the same as with games, like I said up front, I feel like a lot of these design manuals are just sort of like the equivalent of, you pick up a book on designing your own software and it's all just, okay, well, pick sans serif for serif font and pick a color from this palette and you're kind of good to go. And it's like, no, you've just begun. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know why. I feel like maybe with like system design, there might be like a little more of that, but not even in like as much of a structured way. I feel like people approach that a little bit in like hacks and SRDs and stuff, yeah. If you want to do like an Into the Odd hack, you can find one. If you want to do, in like a Knave hack, there is like, I feel like there's a process to it somewhat, or even like SRDs or things like Spencer Campbell has put out like a creator kit for like the Lumen system, and it really breaks down the system and how it can be adapted and stuff like that. So like, I think maybe for design there is a little bit of that, and I wish there was a lot more of that. Some people will put out SRDs and stuff, but specifically when I think of a really solid creator kit. Like I said, I think of the Lumen one from Spencer Campbell. But as far as adventure design or adventure writing, I feel like everybody feels like they're just, I don't know, reinventing the wheel. And every time that they want to write an adventure and like they feel like they have to some way, a little bit. One thing that I've noticed recently, Bastards from Mike Anderson blew up, and the way in which they laid out the original simple dungeon that they had was a very distinct style, and a lot of people afterwards stuck with that style format, with the way that the map was done, the way that the layout was done, and things like that. And I felt like that's the closest I've seen to people having almost like a style guide and writing a bunch of adventures that are, have a at least a similarity through all of it. And it's great, and it's really approachable. I wish there were more, even if there wasn't as much academic stuff like this, I wish there were more like style guides where people could look at like loot gearing, right? Some amazing adventures. It'd be awesome if there was like a style guide for how I made this adventure this way, or what's my insight into these things. And they have a blog, and it's fantastic. But as far as even just the academic side of like why I do this and why it works, I just wish there was a lot more. I wish there were people that had like the academic side of this to do, and I don't know why there's not. I don't know if it's because, in video game design, a lot of the people that do that are paid people working for a studio or something like that. And in a lot of the indie TTRPG space, a lot of people are indie TTRPG creators. It's really just them.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's, a couple of people. I know people think that Free League is some huge company putting a bunch of stuff out, but I'm pretty sure they have like 12 employees and a bunch of freelancers. So they're not even like a huge company doing a bunch of stuff. So I don't know where the disconnect is between, like what we're talking about here, like the academic side of adventure design, of level design, and all the rest of this stuff, and a consistency that's being put out. Like I feel like more than anything, people are just taking styles of things and trying to make it their own, versus taking like an academic process and using it to make something. And I don't know where the disconnect is, but I would love something like this to come out as a manual or a book process that you can go through that has the step-by-steps exactly like some of the other books that we've read through, but this for tabletops, not for video games or just general quote-unquote game design and stuff. And I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's I can only really speculate, but I feel like part of it is the fact that there's kind of a pretty low barrier to entry when it comes to tabletop games as compared to other game industries. Because I also do computer game development, and it's I'll attend like the RPG conferences and be in their space, and then I'll be over in like the computer and video game space, and it feels like a completely different world in terms of how people talk about the craft of making games. And like I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, because I'm sure people could probably point to examples in the tabletop RPG space where people are doing this really kind of mindful, theory-driven work, and they're really kind of making an effort to put RPGs in dialogue with the broader game design industry. But in general, it really does feel like in the RPG world, people are just sort of, I don't know, they're just drawn off their own gut feelings, maybe drawn off their own experience, or they develop this sort of like, pigeon that this sort of like ersatz game design vocabulary that exists. And I think that's because it's, and I say this with an appreciation for the sort of democratic and DIY. Like, I don't necessarily, feel like it's, totally a bad thing that there's a relatively low barrier to entry. But in a lot of ways, it's like anybody who can use Google Docs can become a tabletop RPG designer. Mm. Whereas with, there's a higher barrier to entry with, like developing other kinds of games, like computer games, for example. You got to generally know how to program or do some kind of development adjacent work, like animation or sound design. And that's why, you still got a lot of a lot of scrubs, but it's a much higher barrier, you know what I mean? And I think related to that, I'm trying to find numbers here on Google, but like I'm trying to find like total revenue. Let's see here. What does Google say? So I just Googled like tabletop RPG industry gross income, and maybe somebody more knowledgeable than me can correct me. But it says here from Statista, total revenue for the RPG segment was projected to reach $63 billion. So like let's compare
62.9 is WotC or
I don't know. It just says total revenue in RPG segment. But basically, what I'm trying, let's see, video game industry gross 2022. So my Google foo is failing me. But basically, the idea being that if you compare the video game industry, for example, to the tabletop RPG industry, like tabletop RPGs are like a blip on the radar, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I was just looking at my favorite video game, Doom Eternal. Just that one game brought in a profit of $500 million. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and so I think that's part of it too, is when you have that, and I'm just speculating here, I could be totally wrong on this, but my feeling is that there's a financial incentive where, okay, like if we're going to be investing millions, potentially even billions of dollars, AAA studios are really, really costly to run and have hundreds, if not thousands of employees spread across the world, then maybe, we need to be a bit more rigorous in our approach to design. Like listening, to my favorite game designer, Hugo Martin, creative director of the new Doom games, to hear him talk about game design as compared to, a random D&D tuber on YouTube. I don't want to denigrate too much, but it really does feel like night and day to me. But maybe I'm just talking out my ass.
I think there's also this weird. I mean, Twitter is one of those spaces where, I miss the G+ days, which sounds like the loss of that was a big loss to the entire industry. But you get this weird thing where, as I said before, there's people that like to discourse about somehow like Merkborg and Free League being some type of like corporation now, and how that's somehow a bad thing. When again, I think they have like 12 employees and they might have some money or whatever, but if you actually lump them up against something like even Pathfinder, much less WotC and Hasbro, it's not even close. But there's this weird thing where like if someone gets big and successful enough, there's this like instantaneous turning against them that somehow now they're corporate and it's a bad thing and it's all the rest of the stuff. And it's just like a lot of designers out there, I think, are amazing designers, but when you have this DIY aspect, it's hard to even afford art for projects and things for a lot of stuff. So there could be some amazing game sitting out there on itch with 50 downloads, but it has no art, and the creator, can't afford InDesign or something to do good layout for it, and this or that. So like there's a massive financial barrier. But as there is in video games, the difference is I think that in video games there are a bunch of these like massive studios that bring talent in and do stuff and what like that. And I don't think that's really anything that the TTRPG industry has outside of like adventure writing for maybe like 2 or 3 companies. There aren't big places, and even then the pay for a lot of that for freelance is woefully low in the current economy and just in general. I mean, you're talking about people wanting to pay like 8 cents a word or something like that, and that's not even close to enough for people to actually turn it into a full-time gig. The number of people that actually have full-time jobs in the industry is incredibly small. And I think a lot of writing and design stuff like that is, purposely kept that way to keep everyone freelance and keep the money low and on expenditures and stuff like that. And I just think it's a weird space where people, as soon as you become a little bit too successful, people want to say you're not indie, even if you only make like, a couple grand a year, or your book, is basically, it's a really nice book, but it's, all the profits go into making the book nicer, and then it's just,
yeah.
The most of those people that have those successful games and stuff, most of those people still have full-time jobs,
Oh yeah.
On top of the game. So it's just a weird spot in the industry where, there's, like you said, a pretty low barrier to entry to get into it, but a pretty high barrier to being really successful in it. And I think a lot of people are kind of stuck in that space. And I think the lack of having, something like studios, not that we need it, not that it's something I'm advocating for, kind of a lot of people that do this really professionally and really kind of inhibits the ability to have those people that can sit down and write academically and are seen as someone that has the chops to sit down and write that down academically. But I don't know. The ttrpg space is still pretty newish. Obviously less new than the video game space. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see as it goes forward. And it would be really interesting to see some type of indie studio co-op thing where enough people can get together and start doing something like that, but I guess we'll see as it goes forward. But I'm hoping that this can be something that people look at as some of that academic stuff that they can really look at and theory craft and have a process to actually run off. The number of people that have looked at and downloaded and done some stuff with cyclic dungeon design, it was awesome to see that, blow up and see how many people were downloading it. And, and even when we use it on here and you use it for all of your stuff, it's just, you can Google jaquaying a dungeon or whatever, and that's about the only process I've ever heard for actually writing up a dungeon. But I've never seen an academic, tome that I can read about doing it. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I loved about it. I love the theory of this stuff and actually having a process. So this process and this whole stream, this whole show has been really, really enlightening and enjoyable because of that, of just having something to build on. The way that I write dungeons, the way that I read adventures will never be the same because of the 10 weeks that we did for this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I want to jump back to something really quick. I was looking at some numbers here. To your point about what we consider large and small in the TTRPG world. And so I looked at Paizo here. So Paizo, according to Google, has 125 employees. And it looks like their peak revenue was 12 million in 2022. So compare that, for example, to From Software, right? Creators of the Souls games and Elden Ring. They're considered a small studio. They have 349 employees, and their revenue, let's see, from last year, average revenue per game is $186 million. Yeah. So, and that's considered a small studio, with not usually popular games, but again, it's definitely, the scale is much smaller, as you pointed out, and it is sometimes interesting to see, it's oh, you have 2 full-time employees, this is big RPG coming in to stomp out the little guy.
You're not indie anymore.
Yeah.
Come on.
But yeah, and I think too with Cyclic Dungeon Generation, I'm looking at it right now, it's just shy of 6,000 downloads, which I appreciate everybody who's taking a look at it. I don't want to give the impression that it's it's theoretical and it's complicated, therefore it's better, but rather for me it's how do we create processes and techniques and theories that move us away from, I think the phrase you've used is the simulationist approach, but get us away from sort of the surface level parts of creating a dungeon, right? Okay, what kind of physical space is it? Does it have goblins, and is it a cave, or is it a fortress, or is it a tomb, and is there undead, and what is it for? Was it that kind of stuff, and move us towards a more mindful approach where it's we have very specific gameplay that we want to create, and how do we design elements, including, in the case of Cyclic Dungeon Generation, the actual layout, the flow of the dungeon itself, to create the kind of play experience that we want people to have in that kind of adventure. Like, you don't get, like, if you went through the process, okay, cool, I have a dungeon and it's a goblin and it's tomb and it's cold. It's like, okay, like I guess that's interesting, but this doesn't really give me much to work from in terms of then, okay, then how do I create an interesting encounter, right? Or how do I create an interesting trap? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's the thing, is it's not that, not saying that this is the end all be all, but it's just like having having a process, and then people being able to look at that process and then go, how can I tweak, adjust, or build? Like, like a foundation of anything at all, versus, I think you said at one point, just like going with your gut, like, I feel like 5e and a bunch of stuff did not help when basically they just write a novel and then say, okay, where can I add a couple of roles in that really don't change the ending of what they're doing? You know what I mean? That's what a lot of people do now, is just like, okay, let me create a story, and I feel like people are moving away from that, which is really great, and getting back to the concepts of just like, be a referee, just give locations and characters and let the players interact in the way that they want, but that then does open the door for what you just said, is like having adventures written in such a way that you can encourage a specific play experience, like the thing that blew me away more than I think anything was trap design. When we went over those episodes, where it's just like, this is not just a hole in the ground and you go click and everyone has to jump out of the way and you roll a dex roll and then just move on to the next thing. It's at all, is it not like that? Like, the traps and puzzles were so innately built into the story of the dungeon, not in like a I'm giving you a story way, but in like thoughtful in the way that, okay, this is a dungeon built by creatures, it would make sense to make it thematically fit. And not only that, how can you also move people through the dungeon and get people into interesting choices and build the lore into it that they can find, in such a way that that's the one where I was just like, I will never not make traps like this again. Like, this is this is the way. Like, this is a way, but to me, the way to do it, versus, again, like, just throw a save on some swinging thing or whatever, and you had a trap. Like, okay, like, that's not remotely close to as interesting or fun or anything, not only for players but for people running it, than the traps and puzzles that we talked about and the ways that you can build it through here. So it's just, I don't know. Like I said, it's nice to just be able to have a foundation and a process from which to start, versus just making it up as you go and hoping it's interesting to people,
Yeah, and giving people sort of an end-to-end process. Like, not that I feel like people have to use exactly the process that we laid out in this series. Like, for me, my hope is that this is just like a starting point, that I guarantee you that smarter people than me hopefully will take this and run with it and continue to refine it. Again, it's the kind of the academic writing background again of like, I want people to build on this and to, put it into practice and see, where it can be improved and fleshed out and those sorts of things. But like, again, another comment on this recent dungeon design book that I won't name because I don't want to bite the hand that feeds too much, is that you go through it and it feels less like an end-to-end process of, okay, you're going to create a dungeon, here's where you start, here are the steps that you go through, with every step being inflected through some theory that, drives you to create things that are fun to play. But it just felt like a lot of disparate tips. And I'd be curious to know sort of what your feeling is, or even people in chat, like, if how that feels as when you're trying to create your own adventure, either for publication or for home use. Like, okay, I just have a million random DM tips like floating around in my head, and I'm gonna sit down. Okay, how do I focus that? You know what I mean? Like, how, I don't know if that's really helpful for people, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
It's not. That's the thing, is I've read like dungeon design books and stuff before, and that's exactly how they all felt. It felt like you just found 8 people that exist in the industry with people whose names you might recognize and said, hey, I'm doing a dungeon design book, write me an article. And then they give them all to you, and you're like, cool, let me just slap it all in. It doesn't feel like there's any continuity to it. It doesn't feel like there's like we've been saying, an end-to-end process. It, like, I have, maybe they exist out there, but for the tabletop space, I haven't been able to find any. And the ones that I've read, even about game design, a lot of the books you've recommended to me since we've known each other, really aren't ttrpg specific. Then we're just like game design specific, so like any game that you want, really, video game or board game or whatever you want. And that's what my favorite part about this has been, is that there is a process. Like, I can sit down and just go, okay, I'm going to come up with a couple of words, and then if I follow this process to the end, I will have a dungeon when I'm done with it, and we've talked over and over again about how easy it is to build on each step of the process as you go forward. And that, like, in most things you do, those resources exist. Like, you're not just going to go to a job and just start winging it, and I don't know if it's because there's like a creative writing aspect to it, but listen, there are processes to creative writing. There are whole manuals on how to do it. Not only that, there are literally whole like acceptable formats in which to have it done, like MLA, APA, like guidance on the way things should be done and formatted, and plenty of processes on how to do it, like no Remo or whatever it's called. Like, there's literally a process by which it says, try to do this many words with this many things, start with these themes. Like, there's literally a thing that just says, bullet point this, and then do this, and then do this, and build until you get to a point where you're doing like 1,000 words a day or whatever. Even that is a process, right?
Yeah.
But that does not really exist, as far as I've been able to find, in our space for adventure writing. And having that, like I said, for this, someone who is homebrewed, someone who's, worked on game design, someone who reads a ton of books, someone who's run a ton of adventures, someone who's read way more adventures, this process was, like I said, incredibly helpful, and has completely changed not only the way I will write adventures going forward, but how we'll read adventures going forward forever. And aside from the fact that it's awesome, just the fact that it is an end-to-end process makes it infinitely more digestible, approachable, and useful than pretty much anything else I've ever read for adventure writing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to add too, and I imagine you can relate to this, is it's very difficult for me to sit down and then not get sucked into that kind of, I don't know, like analysis paralysis. And so for me, I like having a process like this because it takes out a lot of the, I don't want to say decision making, but you know what I mean? It's like I don't have to sit here and then completely come up with a process for creating an adventure from nothing. I don't just sit down and look at the blank screen and be like, okay, well, I guess what do I do? And you get that kind of ADHD paralysis. For me, like, having this stuff set up allows me to not get stuck in that like ADHD brain where I can't concentrate and I don't know where to start. It's like, okay, I don't have to think about what I do first. I don't have to think about what I do second. And I can free up those cycles in my brain to focus on the fun and the creative and the meaningful work of adventure design, and not what I think is a lot of the sort of the static that I think can leave people feeling like they don't know where to start or what to do. I don't know if I articulated that well,
Yeah,
but
no,
you know
I
what I'm
mean
saying?
that's exactly how I feel about it. I mean, again, like, as someone who also is like severe ADHD, and I feel like a lot of the people in our industry are ADHD or neurodivergent in different ways. A lot of the writers that we read from, the people that we hear from, and I feel like having processes like this does very much help the brain focus, because not only does it give you a starting point, it's very, we said this before, digestible. Like, it's small bites. It's, here's a little bit of theory, here is an exercise that reinforces that theory and takes you one step forward, and then after that you just do it again and again and again, and you just have these little bits, but it all builds as you go through to like we said multiple times, like, oh, this is a trap we're going to do. Actually, we can use the parts from this other thing we did 4 parts of this process ago. Boom, already done. Let's just, apply it to this exercise, and then we move on to the next one. So being able to, I mean, it's so much easier to focus on the process and way easier to start. I mean, the first thing is literally just sit down and write some verbs, like, or just themes. Like, what do you want in this? Okay, we're going to do frost, we're going to do undead, we're going to do tomb. Cool. We're doing like an undead ice tomb. Awesome. Now let's come up with verbs. Now let's come up with this. Now let's come up with that. And it all just builds and builds and builds. And it never feels like you're just grasping. It isn't that, like, choice paralysis or analysis paralysis, like you said, where I'm just like, okay, so I need to write an adventure. What am I gonna do? And not only that, like 90% of the stuff that we came up with writing the adventure we wrote during this process, I would have never come up with, would have never thought about. But
Yeah.
because the process made it literally like the way you roll on it and just go, okay, well, like, what is this? Because for me, sometimes it's hard. It's super hard to start from scratch. It's super hard to start from scratch. But as soon as you have a tiny little seed, your brain can just like run, like it'll just sprout suddenly into this huge thing. And you're just like, because the number of times I'm sitting there going, wait, how about this? Like,
Exactly.
it made it so easy. And again, the number of things we put together that I would have never thought about putting together, like the patina ghost, it makes it so much easier, and you get these things that you would have never thought of, and people would be like, man, how did you think of that? And you're just like, listen, I created a table, I rolled on it, I ran with it, like, here's the process for how I did that. And people will be like, oh, that's cool, I can also do that, and then we'll get better adventures.
Yeah, that's my hope is, I just want to see more people feel like they're able to create dungeons that they feel like that they're happy with, that they feel, I'm always really kind of preoccupied with what I have in my imagination and the gap between that and what I actually am able to get on to paper. You know what I mean? And that's what a lot of this process is how can I narrow that gap between what I want to accomplish and what I'm actually able to do, right? What I'm actually able to produce. And that's, even with sort of the random tables, like I said, tables aren't a new thing by any means, obviously. Like, it's every book's got tables in it, but we created very specific kinds of tables that were meant to push us towards that good gameplay design. So we rolled on the moments table a lot, and I think that's kind of like honestly, if there's only one thing that people take away from this whole series, it's the moment driven design. Like, that's really sort of the theoretical framework that drives this whole process. I'm curious if you feel like this is going, sorry, my throat's real dry. You feel like this is going to change your approach to reviewing? I know you don't review a whole lot of adventures on Weekly Scroll. You're more focused on systems, but I'm kind of curious how this is, if at all, has changed your approach to reviewing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I still read a lot of adventures, and who knows, maybe we'll break off and do some adventure review at some point. But the way I read adventures is absolutely completely changed, and even if we don't review them on stream specifically in the Weekly Scroll podcast for like you said, mostly systems that we do, we still read them. I mean, a lot of games come with starter adventures, so it's going to be, and it has been really interesting to read starter adventures after doing this process. Like I said, it definitely changes the way I will read and run adventures forever. There's times where I've read some adventure parts and I can see like maybe little bits of some of this kind of stuff in there, and there's times where I've read adventures and I'm just like, this is exactly what we've said not to do with a lot of this stuff. And also depends on the systems and stuff that we're running. We don't, it's very few and far between that I'm running like a 6-stat D20 system anymore with save rolls and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, quick answer, yes, absolutely. This changes the way that I not only read adventures, but if I were to review them, would be completely different. Like I feel like there's way too many times in adventures where things feel like you could take stuff out and it wouldn't change any aspect of the adventure at all. And I feel like with this process, you really make a dungeon where if you were to take a part of it out, there would be a gaping hole there that would be evident in the dungeon. You know what I mean? Like so much of the stuff that we did in the process is so intrinsically linked and like is seen multiple times and becomes thematic within the dungeon, that if you were to remove a trap, you would just leave a giant hole, versus if you were to remove like a pit trap or a swingy thing or a puzzle or something from something else, you would just have like a door now, right. So, it's vastly different. So yes, very, very, very much so, to answer the question.
So what I want to do now, to turn this from turning into a complete hagiography, I want to open it up to questions from you or questions from the chat about the topics that we covered in this series or adventure design generally, maybe things that we didn't touch on or only hinted at. But yeah, I'm eager to hear what kinds of topics people want to talk about.
Gosh, I'm trying to think of, this is one of those choice paralysis things where I'm like, man, I could ask anything. And what could I ask about? Really, I mean, I guess if I was gonna ask something, just what triggered you to start trying to come up with a process, or to want to approach a process a little bit more?
That's a really good question. Like I said, I work in design, in a design field, in my regular day job, and I have an academic background as well. And what I wanted to do was try to take the way that we approach things in those worlds and bring it over to the tabletop RPG. And part of it too was also what we talked about a little bit earlier, where I really wanted to do a good job. I really loved the Deathtrap dungeon, just sort of format, the genre, if you can call it that. And I wanted to go, okay, how can I create a reproducible process for making these things? Because I felt like a lot of the times it was sitting down and I'm looking at the blank screen and I'm trying to pull, like we talked about earlier, these disparate kind of like DM tips out of the ether and maybe grab onto something to see if it'll help spark an idea. And you end up coming up with kind of mixed quality dungeons because you're sort of just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And for me, I was like, no, I want to really dive in and understand like what makes these things good, in the same way that we do in my regular day job. Like, okay, what are the actual principles in play here? And that's when I started digging into like, the literature about game design, because that was something like I'm kind of surprised that, these books that I'm reading, they're not like particularly hard books to come across. You know what I mean? Like I always feel weird because I want to give people the impression that I'm like diving into I have like this super esoteric big brain knowledge that, makes me better than anybody. I'm like, no, these are literally just books you can go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble and just Google game design, and you just grab them off the shelf. I mean, these are very widely available books. And I'm just surprised that I've never heard anybody in the RPG space talk about any of these books, or any of these theories. And, I get into like, conferences, and it's kind of interesting. Maybe someone can correct me on this, but like, GDC Game Design Conference, which, is primarily video games, but they have traditional games as well. I know that the Magic the Gathering, Mark Rosewater gave a presentation there, but I can't remember a time I've ever seen anybody from the TTRPG space give a presentation at GDC. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'm embarrassing myself here, but I'll hedge and say it's extremely uncommon to see that kind of thing happen. But I learned so much from those talks, and seeing people really engage with the literature and the experience too. Like, I mean, human beings have been making games for thousands of years. There's a whole academic discipline, ludology, which gets into the study of games, and there's just so many different, just really, really great resources for game design in general. And I wanted to go, okay, how can I apply that to what I'm doing with Deathtrap Dungeon, so that when I do sit down, I'm not completely improvising it, that I know what I want to accomplish. I know what makes a Deathtrap Dungeon fun in the same way in my regular job. We know what makes a good digital interface, right? And from there, I just kind of kept just trying to build out. Moments were kind of the first thing to come together. And then that's really where things started to pop off. Because it's like, okay, now I have kind of this like foundational theory, right? Where I can then look at traps and monsters and puzzles and all that stuff and say, okay, how can I design these to encourage these moments? And then stuff just kind of sprung from there. And a lot of it is experimenting with my home groups and just trying things out and seeing what's effective and what's not effective, and cross-referencing that with the stuff that I read. Like, choices was a big one too, and it's so funny because once you start to learn these kinds of game design theories, you start to see them in pretty much every book, and it makes you feel good because you're on the right path. Like, I just bought a game design book that came out, I think, last year, and the first part is just talking about the role of choice. You know what I mean? Like, that was the first thing that kind of crystallized for me, was like every single game design book that I would pick up would literally define games as like it's a series of choices made by the players. And I'm like, okay, if choice design is sort of the nugget here, the fundamental thing that defines a game, well, what are the kinds of choices? You know what I mean? And how does that apply to tabletop RPGs? And it's just stuff like that. I mean, there's other things, like that architecture, Christopher Totten, architectural approach to level design. Huge. That was like a watershed book for me, because that touched on things like reward types, like having the 4 reward types, sustenance, access, facility, and glory. Like, once I had that in place, I'm like, okay, now I can smush that together with moments and create a whole kind of theory for treasure design. I mean, it's just a lot of stuff like that. And what I want to say is, like, I don't want people to think that like my approach is the only way, or that I've got all the answers. I mean, honestly, what I would love to see is just more people who are designing tabletop RPG materials or adventures to just sit down and just dig a little bit into the broader industry, I don't even call it like knowledge discourse. Like, I don't know, I don't want to sound like a dick about it, but just be more of a professional. You know what I mean? That's probably the meanest thing that I've said all series, but it's like in my regular job, like we interview people all the time, and if it's obvious that they've never really like done any kind of reading in the design or the digital space, we don't hire them because they're not going to be effective designers and developers. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like the same should be true of tabletop RPG designers. Like if you're just doing it just for fun, okay, that's fine. But if you like, okay, I want to start my own business, start selling stuff on DM's Guild or Drive-Thru, then maybe dig in a little bit to the universe of knowledge that human beings have put together about game design, and just try to apply that in whatever way you feel like is valuable, instead of what I feel like a lot of people do is that they just sort of go with their gut or draw off their own very limited personal experience being a DM, and that for them is basically the extent of their game design knowledge. Does that make sense? Like, that sounded really catty. I didn't mean it to be, but...
No, I mean, but it's true, and it is. I mean, it's not catty, but it's important because, one of the things that I said was, what you said is this is not the only process, right? But people need to come up with more processes. Like, why literally you have Jaquaying the dungeon, and that's pretty much the only process I've ever heard, right?
Yeah,
and
I mean, you have stuff like the 5-room dungeon, I guess, would be another one, but even that,
kind of, yes, yeah. Kind of, that's okay, sure. That's the extent of it. Is it has 5 rooms, and it should have this many treasures, this many bad guys, and then go. Sure, that is the lowest bar of process. And how much have people built on that? You know what I mean? Like, not much. People still do the same fucking thing, So it's, again, I wish it was a little bit more academic, and I wish these people that were really great at what they do would do more stuff like this, where they actually did put out resources or writing guides, or I think a lot of the people that are really good in the indie space writing adventures and stuff, they go with their gut, and it works because their gut is great, right? But not everybody's is, not everybody can be these great writers or have this great insight into design and stuff. That's gonna be a very, very few and far between people that can write amazing adventures every time they sit down without something, right? And again, this doesn't have to be the only process, but I wish there was just more processes and more approachable stuff to it. What one thing you said was about choice design, right? Like, when I read your course on choice design, I then saw it fucking everywhere. Like, everything you do is a choice, and you can go, that's a now or later choice. Oh, that's like a resource. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you see that everywhere. But then you use a phrase like choice design, and people just go, huh? And it's like, then you explain it, and you're just like, oh, that is a thing,
or even
back, even like what?
Oh, so I said, one of the things too, related to that, is giving people, how can I frame this? Let's see here. I guess I want to encourage people to maybe ask a little more of people who are putting out resources for design. For example, there was a dungeon design book that came out just in the past few months, and one of the articles in it was literally there's different kinds of dungeons. Sometimes they're temples and sometimes they're tombs, and I feel like if this were in any other discipline, the editor of that collection would be like, I'm not publishing this because this is essentially a retread of information that's been published a million times before for 50 years. You know what I mean? Like, if you're doing an academic anthology or just anything, it's no, we want to see writing that pushes the field forward or builds on the work that comes before it. And I think, I haven't looked, but my guess is the book is probably very highly reviewed. And I kind of wish there'd be more people to say, hey, you know what? I can appreciate the effort. I can appreciate you wanting to put out an anthology, a guide to creating dungeons, but we want something a bit more to chew on than a rehash of the same list that I've seen in literally every DMG for like 50 years, is like, these are the different environments. And it came from a really, really like pretty respected, experienced designer. So the fact that like that got past an editor and they looked at that and said, yeah, that's going to be a value add for people in 2023, just kind of, I don't know, it seems strange to me. And I wish that more people would look at that stuff and say, no, give us a bit more. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this, I mean, our entire relationship, like the fact that I even know you, goes back to Necropolis of the Mailed Fist for me, right? And I've told this story before, but I read Necropolis of the Mailed Fist and it blew me away. And then at the time, I was running a meetup at where I used to live, and we had hundreds of people in the meetup, and I set it up as a tournament module, and we had like 5 or 6 tables full with people watching and hanging out to run that whole thing. But even just the first time I read it, it blew me away as something that I had never read anything similar to before. And the more I've got to know you, the more I've read, your courses on moments and on choices, and even going through this process, like even when I read it the first time, could probably not have like really successfully like quantified like why I loved it as much as I did and why it blew me away as much as it did, and then like I said, as we've become friends and as we've talked about design a lot more, and even going through this process, even I'm just like, oh, that's why that was there. This is why this was there. That's why I loved that. That's where that idea came from. And it's just made me love it even more. It's still my favorite adventure, even, content and everything wise, but just like that was I guess, watershed moment for me where I was just like, there's a different way to do stuff. There's actually a way to do stuff. And like, this is way better than like most of the stuff I'm going to do, or stuff I'm going to read. And it's just really, really interesting because you wrote that years ago. And I think we've talked like there's ways that we could even refine that process even now. But even then I was just absolutely blown away. And again, can see so many of the processes that we've talked about through this stream in that adventure that was written, years and years ago. So it's just, I don't know. There's only been a couple of adventures that I've read where I was just like, holy shit, when I close that last page, and most of them are yours. But it's interesting now to be able to have, like we've said numerous times, a digestible process to try to approach something as good as those, for people that are kind of newer to the industry. And I don't know. I don't even know where to go with that. Just,
yeah.
I like we've said over and over again, I feel like now it's just rehashing, like having a more academic source and having a more of a end-to-end process is way more important, I think, to people than just a random book of tips or hashtag DM tips online or any of that kind of stuff, and one thing you said is, I wish people would hold things up to a little bit of a higher standard, and I wish people would get a little bit more academic in the way that they do things and develop things like processes, because those exist in everything. Those exist in everything around the industry that we're in, but not as much in the industry. So I'm hoping that it can get into there, and I'm hoping anyone that's listening to this gets some of that out of this. And
yeah, that's the hope, is that people just feel, I mean, that's why we're doing this, really, is to try and empower people to, really come up with interesting adventures that people gravitate towards. Because, I don't want to commentate on it too much, but I also do feel like there's kind of a, I don't know if you agree with this, like a homogenizing. I just feel like as long as I've been in the tabletop RPG space, and I've been doing this since 2007, 2008, like I'll say this, it's very difficult for me, with the exception of maybe one or two people who are personal friends. I could not pick up a module and tell you who wrote it without looking at the author name. You know what I mean? Like you think about
Mhm.
music or video games or even fiction writing. Like you could look at something and name like, oh, that's this band or that's this studio or this author. But and again, maybe I'm just not plugged into the right spaces, so I could totally be wrong on this one. And but I don't know. I just feel like there's such a homogeneity. There's it just seems like everything is very samey. And I don't know. I try to grab as many adventures as I can, especially like in the more like classic OSR space. And I could not name for you like an adventure that I could like pick up and be like, oh, that's this person. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And with this
No.
process, like, you know, it's not meant to like crunch people down into the same style. It's like, no, I want to give you a scaffolding because, like you talked about, it's a way for you to really let your ideas like pop off, but in a focused way where the ideas that you come up with are flavorful, and help like create good play experiences rather than being this, I don't know. I just feel like I don't know if it's just the culture or like maybe the big studios kind of homogenize things. I don't even know where I'm really going with this, but I guess like I don't know. What's your feeling on just the way that I mean, do you agree that adventures all feel kind of samey? And if so, like where do you think that
Yeah.
comes from?
It's not necessarily I feel like that they're all. It really depends, right? It depends, and I'll get the weekly rant about it out of the way. 5e is not good for the ttrpg industry, and I feel like there is a massive loss of good content that is wasted on 5th edition, and people that could be amazing writers that by choice and by force, because that's where the money is, are stuck writing for a crappy game. And it's disappointing and but understandable, because again, like I said, people are trying to make a living. But the number of times that I've scrolled through Kickstarter and been like, man, this looks awesome, look at that cover art, look at the pitch sounds great, and then I'm like, then I see a 5e tag on it, and I instantaneously will just X out of the page. Don't even care about any other aspect of it. Every now and then I'll see one that's like 5e and OSE, and I'll like keep reading, and I might back it or whatever. But the problem is, you'll like if you see a 5e adventure, it could be awesome, it could be fun, it could be exciting, could be parts of it could be like that. But at the end of the day, if it's for 5e, more likely than not, it is just some narrative railroad, because it has to have a beginning and an end, because that's how 5e adventures work. That's how the game is designed. That's how the modules are designed. So that is what exists in the space as a directive for that, right? And I feel like there's a massive loss of creativity and people that could be doing better things that are doing things for 5e and being stuck in a sellable way of doing things, as opposed to an interesting way of doing things. And like you said, there's very few names where I could sit down and read something and go, it's probably this person. Again, and I'm not going to say them, but there's probably like 2 or 3 people in the entire space where no matter what they write adventure wise, I absolutely have to have it. There's people that I very much enjoy their content for, but a lot of them are more system people, because again, I run a podcast about systems. But as far as adventures go, like you said, there's very, very, very few people I can go, I know exactly who this is, and I want it, and
Yeah.
not
And that
taking
you
away
feel
from
like you're
anyone
going to
that's
get
done
something.
What's up?
Oh, sorry. And you feel like when you purchase it, like you're going to get something like interesting out of it. Like it's not going to be like I recently bought a ton of like Osric, like, AD&D type modules. And I just looked through it and I'm like, why did I buy this? Like there's nothing here that jumps out at me as being like anything that's novel, you know. It doesn't have to be like groundbreaking, but just, you know, they call it in the fiction space. I take these writing workshops and they call them polished rocks, you know, where it's like you just completely buff down and strip out any rough edges or anything that would be sort of your own voice, and you polish it down to make it like everybody else's. And it's just, it really, especially in that space, I don't know, like I said, maybe I'm painting with too broad of a brush, but in my experience, it often felt like there was a very specific, like, I don't know, there was a lot of stuff that you sort of had to do to be considered, I'm putting in air quotes, like considered OSR, you know. And I'm sure that's true of any RPG or any just subculture in general, like, of just, okay, well, that means that you're going to buy it and it's going to be just the same kind of reheated stuff over again. Like, there was nothing about it that really jumped out at me as being like, oh, I can't wait to run this because this is something a little bit flavorful, a little bit different. But anyway,
yeah, I mean, and you know, also to hedge a little bit and to not sound like a complete asshole, this is coming from someone who's, you know, run a lot of stuff but never written a published adventure yet. So, you know, again, take everything with a grain of salt, you know. Don't get too butthurt by some of this stuff. What I would really hope is that people listen to this and go, you know what, I could do better, and I could let my voice shine through a little bit more, and it doesn't have to be homogenized, and I can be unique and be interesting and do something interesting, and, you know, add something more than just another ISBN code to the list. Like, I could actually add something where someone somewhere goes, man, this is my favorite fucking adventure ever, you know. And again, it's hard to break into an industry, you know, where we also exist in an industry where, like, how many like hobby video game designers do you know? You know what I mean? People that are just like, oh, on my off time, I build it. I mean, besides you, but like, it's not a ton. So we exist in this space where you have people that just do it for fun, you know, sitting right next to people that are trying to do it for a living, you know? So it's like, how high of a standard can you really put when those are the people that exist right next to each other? You know what I mean? So there's like, it's a weird space where you have to almost exist in two minds, where you just go, oh, this is just for fun until maybe I make enough money to think about doing it a little bit more for something, and then let's see if it actually works. But, you know, we also live in, many of us, we live in America, where you need 4 jobs just to exist. So the odds of making it in a pretty the niche part of a niche industry makes it extremely difficult. So I feel like, you know, on top of everything that we're talking about, that makes all of this really, really difficult. And again, have to take all of this with a huge grain of salt, because, you know, how it's difficult. It's difficult to exist and live in this industry at a standard in which those can be your worries as much as everything else, where you have the time, money, and know-how, and being in the industry long enough to do those things, when you also have to just exist and feed yourself and stuff. So it's you know, it's not easy, but it's also, you know, as you've said, there are very easily approachable books and resources that you can find. There are PDF libraries online where, you know, you can, you know, find those, you can wink find those resources, you know. So it's just, you know, it is what it is. You know, as we've said over and over again, I hope at least one person listens to this and goes, damn, that's a fun way to write adventures, and writes a good adventure, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I'll say before I kind of steer it back to questions, because I feel like every time I share an opinion, people realize how truly stupid I actually am. But like, it's, you know, I recently reran Mailed Fist after not looking at it for several years, and I pretty substantially redid it. And I think what allowed me to look back at my previous work and be able to honestly assess it and then figure out how to improve upon it was because I had this like theory, this process in place. Because back when I wrote I think I wrote Mailed Fist in 2017, maybe. Um, and Tomb of Mercy was around the exact same time. And I look back on them, and I'm very proud of those. I think those were kind of like when I was first getting some of these ideas in place. But there was still a lot of what we talked about, where I was just kind of throwing things at the wall to see what's stuck, and that's part of it too. Is I want people to be able to have a sort of like a lens that they could look at their old stuff and go, okay, what can I do better, and how can I like look back at what I did before and improve upon it in a meaningful way? Because I think it's tough to look back at your previous work and accurately diagnose what worked and what didn't without having some kind of theoretical framework in mind, or some way to like a heuristic where you can assess it. Like, the big thing that I've been trying to improve on, and hopefully my upcoming Kobold Press stuff and some of the stuff I have coming out for like Shadow Dark shows this, is complexity. Like, I stripped out a lot of stuff from Mailed Fist in the encounters. I'm like, this is too complicated. You know what I mean? And I feel like this process has helped me create more engaging gameplay with fewer elements, because those elements are a bit more mindfully designed. You know what I mean? Like in the past, stuff like Mailed Fist and Tomb of Mercy, the complexity was kind of my way to create interest, because it's like, well, I need to create these sort of novel encounters, and that's going to require a lot of moving parts, because I didn't have a really good grasp at the time of like, how do I really design a monster that really like pops, or a trap. And so I just thought, well, let's just put like a million of them into an encounter and just hope that the complexity, and that's something that my work's been criticized, rightly so, for. And again, like, I was able to look back on it and go, okay, now that I know the complexity was an issue, I can design things that are a bit simpler, but not lose that. It's not any less engaging, because now I know how to, design one trap or one monster, and that can be the focal point for an encounter and still feel very engaging, because now I have a better handle on what does it mean to design an engaging monster or trap. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious if you got any other questions. I know this was kind of turned into our impromptu sort of commentary thing, which has been fun. But yeah, I always like to
rants again.
Yeah. I always get nervous about it, because my takes are always, I don't know, people get mad.
Well, people can get mad on the internet. That's what they do. But the problem is that we talk all the time, I think. So like a lot of questions I have, I've probably asked you at some point. So really, I don't know. Do we want to talk at all about, or we can, push this off, about what our plan is with the adventure that we wrote for this?
Maybe. I think we can give a very, very like rough. I don't want to commit us to anything, because we're still trying to figure out kind of what our plan's going to be. But we definitely have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of taking the ideas that we've come up with, and that's something that I want to reiterate for people, is that this is a very iterative process. So what we've done over the course of Seance is kind of like a first rough draft, a first pass, right? Like, you and I are going to sit down and go, okay, here's the ideas we came up with. Now that we actually commit it to paper and do play test, there's definitely things that are going to need to be refined,
Absolutely.
And that's probably the next step, is just getting that refinement done.
Mm-hmm. I think I will say, I think it's not committing to anything, but I think, I think our hope, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that in one way, shape, or form, this will exist in a way that people will be able to see, right? I think that is a hope, that you'll be able to listen to this and maybe some point be able to read what we've written in a roughly finished-ish way. However that comes to pass, and when that might come to pass, is completely up in the air. But I think I can, I can say that hopefully we will have that for you at some point. So
yeah, absolutely. And to hopefully make it available in both digital and print. So I think it's fair to say we're on the same page that we want to do like a print version of it as well. I think that'd be really cool. Because I think it's also valuable for people to see the finished product, to be able to look back at the process and then see how that actually resulted in what's hopefully like an engaging adventure, you know. I mean, hopefully it is, or else we're gonna look like dopes. But
like it's a couple of jackasses. So I think it's safe to say that is the hope, to eventually that you'd be able to read this and actually have it physically in your hands. But you know, we'll see where that goes. Anyone that actually does have questions about that or whatever, you know, just leave a comment wherever you listen to this, and you know, remind us every now and then to get on that, and we'll see what we can do for you all.
Yeah, and I think that's probably something else that I would like to hear from people about, is where we can take, I don't know, like, I know you and I have talked about how we can extend or expand on what we talked about in this series without doing like another adventure. I know we've talked a little bit about maybe going through published adventures, and like going through my older ones, and you know, what would I do differently? I know that one idea, and I'm curious to see what people think about this, is going through the Tomb of Horrors itself, room by room, and kind of analyzing it through the lens of the process. And okay, if we were designing Tomb of Horrors today, what might we do differently? You know, I'd be curious if that adds value for people, or just other ideas. Because what I want to do is give people more opportunities to engage with this material and to practice it, you know, rather than just you know, being just kind of spectators to it.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that'd be fun. I mean, as you said, we've talked about what we could possibly do to keep this going and to keep this conversation going. And, you know, hopefully the more we, you know, keep the conversation going, the more people we can get to hear it, and the more people we can get to, as we've said numerous times, even if it's not this process, to have a process and to have more intent, you know, in the things that they do, and create something that does add value versus space. So yeah, you know, hopefully this will not be the last time that you hear from me and Sersa together about, you know, aspects of this process or this process in general. And you know, we'll keep people updated, but it would be great, you know, if this is something that you're listening to, you know, leave a YouTube comment, you know, talk about, you know, the parts that you enjoy, the parts that you might need a little bit more explanation on, the parts that might have hung you up, or the parts that really, you know, helped you, you know, shoot forward. Just let us know, you know, what we could, you know, iterate on a little bit more, or what kind of extension of the process that we could do to help out. You know, what do you want to see? What do you want to hear? And yeah.
Yeah, and if you've created something using this process, like, I really love seeing, like, that's honestly what keeps me going. It's why I do this, is being able to see people adapt or implement the stuff that we talked about in this series and then be successful with it. Like, I've been really loving seeing people's cyclic dungeons that they've made. There's been a few blog posts, and I always really love seeing what people come up with. So if you've written, not even a published thing, if you just like, hey, I ran a game for my friends at home and used some of these techniques and they worked out well, I mean, I would love to hear about that and get a conversation going about, you know, how people are not just using the techniques, but refining them and improving upon them. And, you know, because that's, again, that's sort of the academic sort of approach to it, is like, I'm not here to pronounce from on high, this is the way to do it, but rather, like, I'm publishing the first paper, I'm giving the first conference presentation, and then I'm sure in 2 years we'll look back on Seance and be like, wow, that was really remedial. Like, we've learned so much since then, you know?
I hope so. I mean, I hope so.
Yeah.
And I hope in 2 years other people will look back on and say, oh, that was remedial. Like, what, you know, like we've pushed forward since then, you know, like that's the hope, you know, again, like, is to get a conversation going into building better processes, you know, and yeah, so we'll see.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like a good enough place as any to wrap it up for the night.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is. I think that is the end of Seance as we know it for now. We'll see if it comes back in any type of similar format, or if we do something different. Again, we hope that at some point, that this won't be the last you hear from myself and Sersa together about this process, and we'll keep you updated. So where this is not by far the first thing you've done, and not by far the first resources that you have. So where can people find some of the resources that we've talked about? Moments, choices, cyclic dungeons. Where can people all find all that kind of stuff from you, so they can get a little bit more of this process?
Yeah, you can find most of my tabletop RPG stuff at my link tree, which I think there's a little command in chat for that. That has links to my itch.io page, where you can find things like my free cyclic dungeon generation PDF. It also links out to my courses. A lot of the material that we've covered in Seance, you can do a really deep dive through my online courses. So I have a number of courses available through Storytelling Collective at storytellingcollective.com, including Dungeon Design Moments, which is kind of like the introduction to the Dungeon Design Essentials series. There's also Dungeon Design Essentials Treasure, and then coming up here very, very soon, like within the next few weeks, is going to be Dungeon Design Essentials Traps, and that's going to be a beast. That's a big one. With more stuff planned. There's also the RPG Writer Workshop, which they do, I think, 3 times a year, twice or 3 times a year. And I've got material in there on choice design and those sorts of things. Yeah, I think that's probably the next step for people if they really want more, is to go to Storytelling Collective and enroll in those online courses for Dungeon Design Essentials.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely, all of that. If you just go to the Sersa link tree, like you said, it's the link, linktr.ee/Sersa Victory, SERSAVICTORY. It's actually, no, it's not. This is the itch is down below you right there. Definitely want to check out I mean, I highly recommend the storytelling courses, the moments, and especially the moments one. You definitely want to check that out. Very excited for the traps one as well. So go through all those resources. And again, like, aside from, the courses are extraordinarily reasonably priced, but, I think almost all the stuff, if not all the stuff on your itch page, is free. And that's like adventures and the cyclic dungeon generation and like all those kind of things. I mean, it doesn't hurt to throw a couple bucks at it, but, there's a ton of resources out there that are easily approachable for people, for anyone listening, for, relatively inexpensively, so you can get the foundations for this process. But again, I highly recommend all of those things. Definitely check all that out. And if you want to find us and any more information about what's coming up next, or if you want to ask questions or anything like that, you can find us as in the Adventure Archive on Instagram at the.adventure.archive. You can find us on Twitter at ADVNTR Archive. They don't give you enough letters for that. You can also find me all the time at weekly_scroll. That's where I run the podcast with Hunter, where we read and review game systems. Definitely want to go check us out on our YouTube. If you're seeing this, you're probably already at it, but hit that subscribe button on The Adventure Archive on YouTube, and you can find our website at theadventurearchive.net, which will link out to all of these things, including all of Sersa's resources and things like that. So that's where you can find all of Sersa stuff. That's where you can find all of our content, and we appreciate everybody that listened, and hope that you learned something from this. And again, if you ever have any questions, just drop a comment, hit the subscribe button, and we'll do our best to get back to you. So Sersa, this has been awesome. I'm very, very sad that we're actually officially done with this for now. And I really look forward to wrapping up this adventure and what we can do next, as far as getting this process up and running and going for other people.
Yeah, I think this is just the beginning of Seance. So looking forward to the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So All right. Well, that's it. That wraps it. So we will see you all another time. And again, thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, folks.